So you immediately, if you got a child who's adopted or in foster care, it doesn't matter, and I always say it doesn't matter if you're adopted from birth. Number one, a lot of times you have a hard time knowing what the in utero experience was, and number two, just the fact that the child has been adopted, is now separated from that biological figure, the only figure they ever knew for 9 months, is traumatic to their system, and possibly can create an irreparable challenge to the emotional, to the regulatory system. Now, so this all gets knocked off balance. So the hippocampus ideally develops in 36 months. That tells you that until the child is 3 years old, they don't even begin to have the ability to think clearly in the midst of stressful situations. So a child is doing something, say you got a 3-year-old, they're doing something, and they're doing something they're not supposed to do, and all of a sudden you say, stop doing that, why'd you do that? You know we don't do that in this house. Well, you expect that child to explain to you why they did that, and they can't. So they usually say, I don't know. Well, the neurologic reality is that the child really doesn't know why they did it, because their thinking is just beginning to come online at this point. Now, the hippocampus, as I said, works directly with the orbital frontal cortex in helping to think clearly, to have short-term memory, and the prefrontal cortex. You can really tie these together. They're both set at the front of the brain. The orbital frontal cortex, which is considered to be the executive control center of all your social and emotional relationships, does not complete its development until you are 25 years old. Now, I want you guys to be thinking about these things, because this not only applies to your children, it applies to us. So you think about your own history. What was your own history like? What was your own birth like? What was your own first 5 years of life like? How sensitive have your early experiences made you? And then growing up, moving through life, in adolescence, so on and so forth, how have those experiences impacted you? Because see, stress and trauma impacts all these different brain levels. So your executive control center for all your social and emotional relationships doesn't complete its development until you're 25 years old. So we have, up until 25 before we really, just even according to science, can be fully held accountable for some of our actions if we've had all of these really stressful, traumatic experiences. And it reminds me of a book I read by Dorothy Ottenau Lewis, who's a psychiatrist at Bellevue. She wrote a book called Guilty by Reason of Insanity. It's such a phenomenal book because it really, she wrote it along with a neurologist by the name of Jonathan Pincus, and basically she studied, the worst serial killers and sociopaths, psychopaths in society. She went, she met them, she interviewed them. What she found out through the course of writing this book is that every single one of them has significant trauma in their life. And see, we don't get that. We don't get that in the legal system. We don't get it in the correctional system. We don't get it in the mental health system. We don't understand the impact of trauma on the brain and how it affects emotions, therefore it affects thinking and everything else. Now, one of the things I learned from Joseph Ludeau, a New York University neuroscientist, wrote a book called The Emotional Brain. I believe that's the name of it. If not, you can go to postinstitute.com. My whole recommended reading list is on there. He says, in times of stress, this is very important, in times of stress, which is amygdala, our thinking becomes confused and distorted, and our short-term memory is suppressed. And I love that. I love that, especially for education. Okay, but it's also very applicable for parents. In times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted, and our short-term memory becomes suppressed. When you are stressed out, you are not thinking clearly, and you cannot remember. Now, here's the breakthrough. This little hormone called oxytocin sits in a structure of the brain called the hypothalamus, which sits alongside the pituitary gland. The way neurology is supposed to work is that when the amygdala pumps out stress hormones, it passes through the pituitary gland first. Now, when it passes through the pituitary gland, that's when it combines hormones, it becomes cortisol, and then it moves on to the hippocampus. Now, this is your stress axis, essentially. This is how this little feedback system works. Oxytocin, which is triggered from the hypothalamus, which sits right alongside the pituitary, is technically supposed to be triggered once the stress hormones pass through the pituitary. So once the stress hormones pass through the pituitary and oxytocin is supposed to release the oxytocin hormone in a counter effect. Oxytocin is considered the anti-stress hormone. Susan Kaczynska says, oxytocin is the hormone which makes love possible. When I start talking about this, I become almost speechless. And those of you who know me know that when I'm on my game and I'm talking about this stuff, I'm rarely speechless. This stuff makes me speechless because that is so very powerful. And what I want you to understand about this, what you must understand about this, is that oxytocin is a learned response. Listen to that. It's not a learned reaction. It's a learned response. So as an infant, you don't have a developed oxytocin response. Okay, you learn this every time you experience stress, and every time your parent comes and soothes you, takes care of you, plays with you, is present to you, that parent is triggering oxytocin in your brain. The triggering of that oxytocin is teaching your oxytocin response how to release the hormone in the presence of stress. This makes and creates your ability to be calm. It creates your ability to experience love. This is such a powerful hormone. And we're going to get into this presentation about how you trigger it. We're going to talk some about the difference between teen boys and teen girls. We're going to talk about some of the tools and techniques that actually trigger it versus those who that foster it. So you just start thinking, okay, if this is a learned response, and I'm thinking about a child who's experienced trauma from an early stage. Say you adopted your child when they were 2 years old. Well, guess what? That's 2 years that they don't have a healthy oxytocin response. That's 2 years of a diminished oxytocin response ability. All right? If that child has a diminished oxytocin capability or capacity, that child is not going to be able to easily soothe themselves. Then that child becomes 3, and then that child becomes 4, and then that child becomes 5, and pretty soon that child is 15 years old. And in my group home, we work with adolescent boys. These adolescent children have gone through their 0 to 15 years of life with a markedly diminished capacity for an oxytocin response. So they don't have it, which means when they get stressed, bam, it's just stress, bam, bam, bam. And then all of a sudden, the hippocampus is short-term memory suppressed, the thinking is confused and distorted, and then you have this kid, you're like, what is wrong with you? Use your brain. Guess what? He can't use his brain. Why? Because the oxytocin is not being triggered. But let's take the counter approach. All right, let's look at this for a minute. I know you're going to hate to miss my little drawings here, but let's clear that for a minute. If we start talking about the adult brain is the teacher. Okay, the adult brain is the therapist. See, this makes perfect sense when John Bowlby said, for adults who've not had it, the therapist must become the secure base. Basically, what he was saying is for adults who've not had who've not developed a healthy oxytocin response, they have to have an adult who's willing to teach that to them. Okay, this becomes the direct care staff. Okay, this becomes anyone involved in the child's life. When the child gets stressed, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about the stress model too, when the child becomes stressed, the amygdala sends out electrical signals. Okay, these electrical signals get emitted from the base of the brain, and these are warning signals that say help, alert, SOS, I need help, Someone come and take care of me. Someone come and soothe me. Someone come and bring me some love, because I cannot do this for myself. So what happens is that the child signals trigger the adult signals. So it's always funny when I'm on a plane and there's a baby that starts to cry, and initially everyone can kind of not tune into it, and they can kind of be distracted and ignore it. But if the baby continues to cry, you should see the adults start to squirm. Why do they do that? Because their amygdala start to get triggered. And if they don't have a healthy oxytocin response, you're going to do like this one guy who behind me said what that kid needs is to have their butt spanked. That's what that kid needs. Yeah, grown man. A grown man with no empathetic capacity for the cry of a child. Why? Because he didn't have a healthy oxytocin response. That's the only reason, not because he's a bad person, but because he doesn't have a healthy oxytocin response. So he can't calm his own stress down. So all of a sudden this child crying all of a sudden stresses out this adult. Well, guess what? That happens in parenting all the time. Your child starts acting out. Your child is defiant. Your child cleans up their room, and they mess up their room, and they don't want to clean it up. Your child cusses at you. Your child threatens to run away, or your child does run away, or your child is aggressive towards you, or they steal, or they lie, on and on and on and on and on. It's because they don't have a healthy oxytocin response, and their amygdala, which is stress, because stress drives all negative severe behavior. All negative behavior drives all behavior, period. Their stress reaction triggers your stress reaction, which then is going to play on what is buried at your brain stem level, at your arousal system level. You know, what your ability to be calm in the midst of stress is. All of that's going to get triggered when that child starts to cry, and that child starts to emote, or that child starts to act out. Now, what happens when you, the adult, who's the teacher, all of a sudden you become stressed out? Guess what you can't do for your child? You got it. You can't trigger their anti-stress hormone. And if you can't trigger their anti-stress hormone, guess what you are doing? Otherwise, you are increasing their stress. So your inability to soothe yourself, to soothe your stress in the midst of your child's stress, is going to increase more stress. It's going to increase more stress for you as the parent, or the therapist, or the teacher, or the direct care staff. Is going to increase more stress for your child. Therefore, you cannot have anything but an escalating system. And this becomes a conditioned pattern. I was just having doing a coaching call with one of my students today, and we were talking about her children. And as we start talking about it, you know, she's starting out young. She's got twins who are 4 years old. You know, I'm like, this is really good, because right now you can start looking to see where you're creating this conditioned negative feedback loop, right? This repetitious conditioning. When we do something over and over and over and it's negative, you create this conditioned feedback system in your brain. The brain doesn't know how to do anything else except be in that negative state. And that's what I believe, what I found probably in 90% of the families that I've worked with, the only thing that has happened is that they have gotten locked into a negative feedback loop, and the negative feedback loop emits more stress, and it has a diminished oxytocin component to it. When I talk to parents and they are feeling miserable, they're feeling hopeless, they're feeling frustrated, resentful, they hate their kid, they don't want them in their home anymore, that's because they have become locked in a negative feedback loop, which is stress hormone rich and oxytocin deficient. So really, for us as parents, our initial work is always going to be understanding our own amygdala reactions, understanding the things that are buried at our own brainstem, because guess what? Trauma is buried at the brainstem level. I should have said that earlier. Trauma, stressful experiences are buried at the brainstem level. This is so important.